to sign and sell for you guys.
Christmas is right around the corner.
You capitalist.
Thank you. And, as I remember when I was a kid, you know, my mom's favorite criticism of me, she would say, "You are selfish," you know, and I don't think she meant that as a compliment, you know. And when I was 16, I read The Fountainhead for the first time, and she said to me, "You are selfish," and I said, "Thank you." And she didn't like that. So yes, I'm selfish in the proper sense of that term, and. There are two of my books for sale, but we'll conduct business after the Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Yes, this lady right here.
I heard about this new system that they want to put into the American schools called Common Core, and one of the things they teach is that communism is the highest form of government. Have you heard about this, and do you know anything about it?
Let me take off my reading glasses. The question regards Common Core, the new, you know, government standards for government schools. Do I know anything about it? I try not to. You know, I try. There are some things some knowledge that I seek to evade because it just makes me sick. But I do know a little bit about. Somebody was telling me that the Common Core, they've labeled the Boston Tea Party as a terrorist act. Mm-hmm. It's not funny. You gotta laugh. I mean, from the little I know about it, sorry, I don't want to get too emotionally worked up. The little I know about it, what I would expect, you know, would be that the government standards would be hardcore Marxist interpretation of, you know, of American history, of literature, of cognition generally, and you know, and I think must be thoroughly repudiated. First of all, I mean, I think the real propaganda. Ultimately, if we're going to defend individual rights and capitalism, we have to engage in politics, but ultimately the battleground is in the educational system. And I think, you know, we're not going to win until we win in the educational system. And a big part of that is we need to abolish the government school system. We need a free market of education as existed in this country in the 18th and early 19th century. You know, liberate the human mind to families and parents to educate their children as they will. I don't think we'll ever have. There's two things that's necessary, I think, to have a civilized society. One is a culture of reason, emphasizing the mind, as Ayn Rand does in Atlas Shrugged. The mind is mankind's tool of survival. And two is the politics of individual rights. We need both of those things. It's not an accident the United States was born in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. I mean, the revolutionaries who founded this country were the leading minds of the American Enlightenment. Benjamin Franklin, right, greatest American scientist of the 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, all-around genius. James Madison, you know, who Jefferson referred to as the greatest man in the world. Thomas Paine, who wrote in his book, you know, The Age of Reason, "My own mind is my cathedral." You know, these were, you know, men of the mind. These were the leading thinkers of the American Enlightenment. And contrary to 21st century American conservatives who like to paint this as the American Revolution as basically a Christian phenomenon, that's not true. It's basically an Enlightenment phenomenon. It's not an accident. This was the 18th century. Christianity barely existed. Well, no, I was going to say Christianity still was a cultural influence, but it was greatly attenuated from what it was in the Middle Ages. You know, you ask yourself the question always, you know, why here and why now? Why 18th century North America? What's special? The American Enlightenment is what's special. If Christianity had been responsible for this, you would have expected it when Christianity was at the height of its power in the 8th century, during the Dark Ages, not during the 18th century, when its power was greatly attenuated. But no such phenomenon as an American Revolution or anything similar happened during the heyday of Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It happened during the Enlightenment for a reason. You read Peter Gay, who's the leading historian on the Enlightenment, you know, his massive 2-volume work, The Enlightenment Interpretation. Notice even the titles. Volume 1, The Rise of Modern Paganism. What a perfect title. Now, it's not like literally there were many pagans in Europe or the United States, or Britain's North American colonies during the 18th century. But what Peter Gay is referring to is the resurgence of the Greek approach, the Greek emphasis on reason, on secularism, on philosophy and science, and the great attenuation of Christianity's influence during the Enlightenment. This is what made possible, the culture of reason is what made possible the politics of individual rights. So this is what we need. The Common Core, from the little I know about it, like I said, I've tried to evade the knowledge, is from the antipode of the Greek approach that's necessary. It's a product of German philosophy. And by German philosophy, I mean Kant, Hegel, and Marx. Who I think of as the unholy triumvirate who dominate Western culture. So we need Greek philosophy, Aristotle in particular. And Ayn Rand represents the 20th century revival of the Aristotelian tradition. But yeah, the little I know about Common Core is exactly what I would expect. It's hideous, irrational, politicization of education, socialization of education, pushing us towards, would they say communism was the highest form of government? Well, there you go, that speaks for itself. I rest my case. Communism. Life belongs to the state. How many people did the communists murder and counting in their remorseless class struggle? According to the Black Book of Communism, based on archives from, communist regime, foreign communist regimes, based on the secret police archives, a minimum of 100 million people, 100 million innocent victims. Other hands over here? Yes, this lady over here.
I guess at the heart of capitalism is this idea that if you work hard, you will make more money and be more, what's the word? I don't know. If you make more money, or if you work harder, you make more money. Well, I'm just curious how you think that applies to like the modern day in which the wealth distribution is incredibly skewed. CEOs make a lot of money, and I don't think they work nearly as hard as that money speaks. And you've got a lot of people who are rich, who stay rich because they inherit the money, and you've got a lot of people who are poor because they stay poor because they just can't work their way up. Do you think in the modern day, especially in America, that the idea that you work harder and you make more money, do you think that's still true?
All right, the question is, part of the capitalist ethos is the idea that if you work hard, you could work your way up from poverty into middle class comfort or into the wealthy classes. And is that true? The question is, CEOs make a lot of money. I don't know, how hard they work. There's people who inherit money. There's people who are born poor and remain poor. I think under capitalism, I think that's absolutely true. Under the mixed economy that we have with an enormous amount of socialism in the present in the system, I don't think that's as true. I think to the extent that we have capitalism in the system, to that extent it remains true. Now, there's a lot of the CEOs, I agree with you to this extent. Some of the CEOs anyway, who make I want to say make money. To me, I think that means earn money. Who get a lot of money, get a lot of money because of government pull, not because of productive ability. They're not Carnegie, they're not Rockefeller, they're not Hill, they're not Morgan, they're not Harriman. They have, what they call GM now, government motors. If you have pull with the government, if you have connections, that you can get government financing, you can get government bailouts, you can get government handouts, you can get the government to give you tons of money that you've never earned by producing commodities and competition on the marketplace that the customers value over those of your competitors. So in a mixed economy, it's not nearly as true as it is under laissez-faire. Under laissez-faire, it's absolutely true, and the history of laissez-faire corroborates that abundantly. I mean, Andrew Carnegie, of course, is the paradigm example of the rags to riches story. The guy who literally, at age 12, was working for $1.20 a week, and by the time he sold Carnegie Steel to Morgan and a bunch of other people, he sell for $400 million or something like that. He's one of the wealthiest, at the turn of the 20th century, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Now, there's plenty of other examples. Even in the mixed economy, Sam Walton did something very similar. He came out of the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, and he had to work like 5 jobs to literally work his way through high school, and founded Walmart and made a ton of money. So it's still possible because there's still some capitalist elements in the country. But To the extent that a country is capitalist, to that extent the rags to riches story is true. And don't forget something. Riches. It's not just, you know, being a millionaire that we're talking about. How many people, including gazillions of immigrants who came to this country literally with nothing, work their way up into middle class comfort? You don't have to be a millionaire. You know, if you're making $30,000 a year in the United States, you're vastly wealthier than 90% of the population all over the world. You know, that's what one reason why the immigration patterns run to America, not from America, is because of the increased chance to prosperity. You know, workers want to come here from Mexico. They don't want to go to Mexico. From here. And I understand that. If I was born in Pakistan or Guatemala or Mexico, I'd want to come here too. So yeah, it's definitely true. But the main reason people come here is not for prosperity; it's for freedom. And that's going down the drain. You know, as socialism becomes increasingly prevalent too. But yeah, under laissez-faire, the rags to riches, or certainly the rags to middle class wealth story is immensely true. You know, and gazillions of examples. Maybe one last point I want to make here. It's a philosophic point, and that is poverty will always exist. It's impossible to wipe out poverty. I don't say unlikely to wipe out. I say it's impossible, logically impossible. I mean, well, why? Well, because poverty is a relational concept. So it's like, by analogy, it's like, you know, being tall or short. So I'm 6 feet tall. Well, I used to be. I shrunk an inch in my old age. But so I'm 5'11". Am I tall or short? Well, relative to whom? You know, relative to Shaq, you know, 7 foot NBA Hall of Famer, you know, I'm short. Relative to a petite, you know, 5 foot woman, I'm tall. And similarly with money, so I'm making, let's say Clemson's paying me $50,000 a year this year. They hired me to write a book on heroes and hero worship. I got the best job in the country, man. They're paying me to write a book on heroism. So I'm making $50,000 a year in South Carolina. Well, does that make me rich or poor? Relative to whom? Relative to, you know, software billionaires or millionaires, I'm poor. Relative to the entire what now called the third world, people all over the world, I'm fabulously wealthy. So, you know, somebody who's making $16,000 a year or $20,000 a year in America today is poor by American standards. Wealthy by the standards of, you know, almost the entire non-capitalist world. So, one conclusion I come to is poverty will always exist, but what can happen, and has happened historically since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, is that capitalism and the Industrial Revolution has raised the level of what it means to be poor. I mean, the classical definition of poverty, which still exists all over the non-capitalist third world, is the inability to feed yourself and your family. You know, starvation level. That was wiped out by capitalism by the turn of the 19th century. I mean, it's so ironic. I mean, Marx and Engels, writing in the 1840s, Frederick Engels' book, Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844, published in 1845, talks about the extreme poverty of the English working class, which we know is true. But he also makes the claim that the 1840s English factory workers are poorer than the workers of the domestic cottage industry of 60 years before that, you know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, which we know today is absolutely false. Absolutely false. It would have to be. Because what the Industrial Revolution does, see, one of many errors that Marx and Engels make is the idea that what they tell us is that, you know, workers have to sell their labor to the factory owners, and in return for that, all they get is a low wage. They're looking at what economists call monetary wages or nominal wages, but they're not looking at the key point, what economists call real wages, right? Which is your income measured not in terms of how much money you make, but your income measured how much purchasing power you have in the marketplace. What can you buy with your money, which is a lot more important than how much money you make. What the factory system does, what industrialization does, is it immensely increases the supply of consumer goods using steam power or electricity or, you know, derricks and cranes and steam shovels and you know, et cetera, et cetera. You make much more cotton clothing, you make it grow immensely more food, et cetera, which means that your money buys you more stuff. And, you know, in the 20th century, the field of economic history developed. And historians actually started studying some economics and developed the field of statistics, you know, to analyze the data. And by the late 20th century, it was clear cut exactly what economic science predicts. That if you immensely increase the supply of consumer goods relative to the demand for the consumer goods, prices come down, real wages rise, and people across every strata of society can buy more food to eat, more coal to heat their homes or cook their food, more clothes, et cetera, et cetera. Economic history, by the late 20th century, established exactly what economic science had predicted. Real wages had risen by the exact period that Marx and Engels were writing in, had risen significantly from what they were in the late 18th century, just before the Industrial Revolution begins. It would have to be. It's in a free society. I'm speaking as a philosopher. I'm not an economist, but in a free society, I would argue it's impossible, not unlikely. My claim is it's impossible in a free society to immensely increase the supply of consumer goods relative to demand for those goods and have real wages decline. That's not possible. That's no more possible than jumping off the observation deck of the Empire State Building and flying to Europe by flapping your arms. One would violate the laws of physics, the other violates the laws of economics. It's metaphysically impossible in a free society to immensely increase the supply of consumer goods relative to demand for them, which is exactly what industrialization does, and have real wages decline. That's not possible. If the supply of goods increases tremendously relative to demand for them, then price of those goods comes down and your money buys more. The English working class of the 1840s was immensely better off than the working class of the pre-factory system. Pre-1785, it's roughly the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. That's the year, it's called the Big Bang of the Industrial Revolution. That's the year the powerful Watt and Bolt steam engines are first applied to driving the mules and the power looms in the English factories. And you begin to churn out a tremendously increased supply of cotton clothing. Yes, Alex?
So as a philosophy student myself, I have a question because you touched upon materialism. So I'm sure you're aware of like how, for example, Descartes surmised that the way an immaterial object like the mind communicated with a material object like the body was by divine command. And so my question is, what's the secular, from what I understand, Rand she didn't believe in dualism, I guess is the correct term, but what's the alternative if you don't believe everything's material, but you're not a dualist, then how does the mind communicate with the body? How does an immaterial object communicate with a material object?
That's a good philosophical question. See, we're here discussing capitalism, so to some extent, even though we're discussing the moral basis of capitalism, to some extent we have to get into economics. But that's the kind of question that personally interests me a lot more. Why my PhD's in philosophy, not in economics. But anyhow, the question, of course, is to Rand, how do you explain mind-body interaction? Rand's not a materialist. She doesn't think, one thing that materialism does is, again, it's a simple philosophy, right? Everything's matter. So these human beings are bodies. Well, the mind is just the brain. So how the brain interacts with the stomach, how the brain interacts with the heart, how the brain interacts with the circulatory system is not a mystery. It's pure biology, right? You just need to advance this biology and we'll answer the question. But Rand's not a materialist. Doesn't think that the mind is, she's not a reductionist, in other words. Reductionism means that you can explain X entirely 100% in terms of Y. So she doesn't think you could explain mind 100% in terms of body. So here's my understanding of this. I think Rand is a dualist of a certain kind. There is body and there is mind. That's two, right? Body, mind. You can't reduce one to the other, then there's two. That's an inescapable conclusion. But dual means two, of course. Dualism doesn't necessarily presuppose the Platonic, Christian, Cartesian substance dualism. Doesn't necessarily mean, doesn't necessarily mean the mind, the soul, consciousness, spirit, call it what you will. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a substance, a spiritual substance, a ghost. Now, the metaphysical dualists, Plato, the Christians, Descartes, it's a logically impossible question for them to answer, the one you've raised. That is, and Descartes wrestles with it. He's a dualist and he's a Catholic. So here's the soul, which is a ghost in effect. It's an immaterial substance. And here's the body. Well, how do you get them together? How do you? If we think of the mind as ensconced somehow within the confines of the skull, I understand how we could drill a hole in the skull and pour a gallon of Tropicana orange juice in there. It's orange juice is a material thing, but the soul or the mind is not material. It's got no spatial dimensions. How are you going to get it? How are you going to get a thing which is not spatially extended to inside a thing which is spatially extended? It's impossible. You could get a car in a garage. They're both spatially extended, and the car is small enough to fit in the garage. But something that's not spatially extended, has no length, width, depth. How are you going to get it into a spatial container? You can't. It's illogical. It's hopeless. I noticed that Descartes doesn't even attempt to answer the question. He says the interaction occurs in the pineal gland, as if the question was where does the interaction occur, not by what means does it occur. He dodges the question. He doesn't even attempt to answer it. He answers a different question. It's a straw man. His whole argument's a straw man. I think Rand very much here in the Aristotelian tradition. I think Aristotle, as philosophers, would put as enormously suggestive on this issue, because Aristotle's point about form being matter organized into a certain pattern or structure, and I think Aristotle's point here, I think Rand would agree with this, is what's the human body made out of? Aristotle couldn't have known it in the 4th century BC, but chemistry's come a long way since then. Carbon, right? Oxygen, nitrogen, you take the constituent elements of the human body, whatever they happen to be. You know what they say about philosophers, don't you? We know all things in general and nothing in particular. So you take the constituent elements of the human body, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, in the proportion, roughly, that they exist in the human body, and then you organize those elements into this structure that we have here, or here, or here, or here. You organize them into the pattern or structure of a human being. And I think Aristotle's point is rational consciousness is a direct and inescapable consequence of organizing matter in that form. And then when you say, well, what is consciousness, though? As if consciousness has to be some kind of stuff. As if it's not a bodily stuff. We're rejecting materialism. It's not a bodily stuff. And if it's not a spiritual stuff or ghost, we're rejecting religion and metaphysical dualism. Then what is it? And I think the Aristotelian objectivist answer is that consciousness is a function. It's not a thing. It's not a substance. It's an activity. It's a function performed necessarily by organizing matter into a certain form. And it gives you the capacity to think. It gives you the capacity to understand reality. It's an activity. It's an activity performed by certain kinds of beings. You organize certain chemical elements into a certain form or pattern, and you get the capacity for this type of activity. I think that's the rough answer. The Aristotelian objective of substance, neither material nor spiritual, but rather as a function or an activity. And I think that's a certain type of dualism that's different from the Platonic, Christian, Cartesian dualism. And as a philosopher, this is part of metaphysics of human nature, and the nature of consciousness is not my area of expertise. But if you're interested in this, I think there's an enormous amount of research and writing to be done on this. You could write whole books on this. You could make a career, out of exploring the nature of consciousness, the relationship to the body. I think there's a great deal of work to be done in the field of philosophy on that issue. Yes, gentlemen.
Excuse me. I wonder if you could discuss the relationship of Henry Ford to the Dearborn Independent Publication.
The relationship of Henry Ford to the Dearborn Independent publication. No, I don't have any idea actually. I don't know. I don't know anything about it.
You can ask me about that later. I'm a historical presenter at Greenfield Village.
All right, there you
But,
go.
so.
There you go. Yeah, ask this lady. Ask her after the outset. Yeah? All right. We'll take one more question. Then you ask the question. We'll take one more question. Then we'll sell books. This gentleman over here.
What was the official reason why the government school system got started? And what was the hidden reason why it got started?
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. That I do know something about. You know, and the question is, you know, what's the real reason why the government school system got started? And I got a whole chapter here in Capital Solutions on government schools and on a free market of education. It's interesting because the myth is, the socialist mythology is that educational levels in the country in the turn of the 19th and early 19th centuries were low, and we needed, you know, government schools to raise the level. We know today that's false. By the way, it was roughly 1990. Ted Kennedy, of all people, Senator Kennedy's office issued a memo because government school system. Guess what state it was originally came from? I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. What state? Massachusetts, absolutely, Massachusetts. And PROM, right, the People's Republic of Massachusetts. Ted Kennedy's office issued a memo that in 1850, just before the imposition of government schooling, the literacy level in the state of Massachusetts, I don't remember the exact number, was something like 97%. It was something enormously high. That it has never been that high since the imposition of government schooling. Ted Kennedy's office issued this memo. Don't ask me why, but it's true. Well, Ted Kennedy was also one of the guys who wanted to deregulate the airline industry. So, you know. But what's the real reason? Well, there's 2, and it's not hidden in American history either if you do the research. One is basically the Irish immigration into the United States brought an enormous number of Catholics, you know, into the country. Many Protestant Americans, not necessarily all, but many Protestant Americans feared, as they put it, that the United States was to become the sewer of Ireland, that the Irish Catholics were loyal to the Pope, you know, to the Vatican, rather than to the United States. And the great cure for that was going to be government schools, mandatory attendance, and the imposition of the Protestant Bible. And notice what happened in the late 19th century. By the 1880s, these Catholic kids were were being so propagandized in the government schools by the use of the Protestant Bible that the Catholic bishops mandated that there needs to be a network of Catholic schools, private Catholic schools across the country, so that Catholic kids wouldn't have to go to the government schools or be propagandized to with the Protestant Bible. It's one great example of what economists often refer to as the law of unintended consequences. The unintended consequence here is this vast network of Catholic schools that we see in the United States today, because of that. But that's not bad enough. The real reason is even worse. Well, the underlying reason, and that is that many Americans, like I said, Germany's the land of poets and philosophers, right? Well, the philosophers, Kant and Hegel, what teachings, Hegel in particular. Well, Kant's ethics, Immanuel Kant, a great influential German philosopher, his ethics, the essence of Kant's ethics is that he is the guy who fully and finally divorced egoism, the pursuit of your own happiness, from a proper ethics. And a proper ethics to Kant is dutiful. He's known as the duty man in the history of moral philosophy. It's that's D-U-T-Y. That virtue lies in selfless service too. Kant never specified to whom. He was concerned with motives. Your motive had to be, utterly selfless. It didn't matter what the consequences of it actually were. But Hegel accepts Kant's edict that virtue lies in selfless service and specifies who the beneficiary is. Like, you get one guess. So the state, with a capital S, society with a capital S. I always thought Hegel's, you know, if Hegel's typewriter didn't have uppercase letters, his whole political philosophy would have simply collapsed. What does he say? Hegel says, the state is the march of God through history. The state is the, capital S, the state is the march of God through history. I don't know what that means, but it sounds scary. Does that mean that the state in some sense is divine? Yeah, I think it does. Does that mean that the state in some sense is infallible? Well, yeah, I think it does. And German children had to be trained and educated that their life doesn't belong to them, their life doesn't belong to the family, their life belongs to the state. And the Germans had imposed national mandatory government schools, and if the parents didn't like it, the children would be taken away from them legally. Be taken away from the parents, and that's still that way in Germany. Did you see that story a couple of weeks ago? That homeschool family in Germany, their kids were taken away from them? Some things don't change. Well, American, you know, I don't know what to call them, collectivists, influenced by German philosophy, by Kant and Hegel, you know, we were enamored of this. They hated the basic principles of the American founding. You know, the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because that's selfish. It's selfish, and we need the American kids to be trained that their life doesn't belong to them, and their life doesn't belong to the family, their life belongs to the American state. And a lot of these American educators, many of them from Massachusetts, traveled to Germany in the early 19th century and studied the German school system, where they had nationalized the mind. You know, they're training these young kids that their life belonged to the German state. By the way, notice something. 100 years later, in the early 20th century, the progressive educators, John Dewey, what's his name, William Hurd Kilpatrick, I forget his name, George Counts, many of the leading progressive educators, 1920s, 1930s, 100 years later, where did they journey to? What Mecca did they journey to see a fountain of education? To the Soviet freaking Union under Stalin. And they loved it. And they glorified it, you know, that the Soviet schools were training these kids that their life belonged to the proletariat, their life belonged to, you know, to the state, that egoism is evil. And they brought that idea back to the American schools in the 20th century. Well, their counterparts 100 years earlier had gone to Germany to study essentially the same thing. So the panacea or cure-all for the selfishness and individualism and egoism of the American system was to be German-style government schools, mandatory attendance where the kids would be trained that their lives did not belong to them but belonged to the American state. Those are the deepest reasons for why government school system has been imposed in this country. If you look at the history, again, I have a whole chapter on this. I'll just give you a few examples because Brianna wants me to wrap this up, and I don't want to, I don't want to anger her.
By preference, I can leave.
But no, I want to sell books. You're right. Thanks for reminding me. Literacy and educational levels were very high in the United States, much higher than they are. To look at some of the evidence supporting this, the Federalist Papers. You guys read the Federalist? This is very high-level political philosophy, you know, written by, you know, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay in support of a constitution for the fledgling republic. These were newspaper editorials in the late 18th century. They were intended for and read by the common man. You know, the intelligent layman, the man in the street, was reading the Federalist papers. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is written in very plain style, but again, very high level, you know, political theorizing. I don't remember the number of copies sold. It was something like, there was a free population of 2 million in the American colonies, and it sold something like 400,000 copies. I probably have the numbers a little wrong, but something like that. It sold an enormous, you know, number of copies to a small population, you know, being read by the masses. In the early 19th century, look at the books that were bestsellers, the novels of, you know, the American novelist James Fenimore Cooper, the Scottish novelist Walter Scott, was selling millions of copies in the United States to a population that was like 20 million. This is what the American public was reading. I don't think my college kids today could read Walter Scott or Fenimore Cooper. This is not easy reading. Thomas Sowell, you guys know who Thomas Sowell is, the American economist? Yeah, Thomas Sowell points out in his book on American, was it Inside American Education? I love Thomas Sowell. I got about a dozen of his books in my library. But Thomas Sowell points out that the McGuffey readers, you know, I think it was the 4th grade excerpts, you had the kids reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. The 5th grade reader had the kids reading excerpts from Shakespeare. You know, the questions that these kids were called upon to answer were very high level material. You know, the McGuffey readers sold 120 million copies in the 19th century and early 20th century. This was not, as Thomas Sowell points out, these were not the textbooks of the elite. These were the textbooks of the masses, you know, of millions and millions and millions of American kids, you know, got their education. So there's an enormous amount of evidence that, including, you know, French visitors like, you know, Alexis de Tocqueville, you know, talked about, you know, the Americans. I don't remember his exact quote. Democracy in America, the Americans are the most educated people in history. You know, there's an enormous amount of evidence, you know, that the American educational system was at a very high level in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I mean, guys like Benjamin Franklin, who came out of a poor family, you know, whether Thomas Jefferson, who didn't come out of a poor family, but guys like Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, they were educated in homeschooled or in small private schools in the countryside, or they were self-educated. There was a lot of schools in the American colonies required for admission, you know, to elementary school, that the child already know how to read. That was expected that mom and dad would do that at home. And you can see what how hard is it to teach a kid to read? It's not hard. I tell my students who are 20 years old, you know, they're future parents, I say, look, you want to teach your kid to read? I'll tell you how to do it 2 steps very easily. First, I did this with my daughter. First, you have to show the kid that reading is fun. And what I did with Penny, you know, from the time she was she was 2 or even younger, you know, we'd go to the park and play, we do all these things, you know, and then play games and everything, and we go to Borders, which was still in existence then. You know, well, library, whatever. And I said, Penny, pick out any book you want. No matter, I don't care how stupid it is, just pick out something that looks interesting to you. And I remember she'd pick out some ridiculous book about some cat who wandered up and down an alley and got 6 dinners Sid, got fed by 6 different families, you know, and everything. But had a cat on the cover, it intrigued her. I remember she's like 2 years old. I remember she sat down in her diapers, you know, and she patted the floor next to her and she said, sit down and read to me, Daddy, you know. So, but the thing is, the first thing you got to do is teach the kid that reading's fun, that there's stuff in these books that she's gonna like, he or she's gonna like. So you have the kid read anything he wants, whatever it is. I was reading all this stuff on baseball when I was a kid. And then secondly, once the kid knows that reading's fun, then he or she's motivated. And by the time he's 4 years old, you don't have to wait till the kid's 6 years old like we do in the United States. At 4, certainly by 5, the overwhelming majority of children are capable cognitively of learning how to read. There's only, what, 26 letters in the alphabet? Was it 43 or 44 sounds? Use phonics. It works. It's very easy to teach a motivated child how to read. You can do it in 2 weeks, literally. Just like riding a bike, learn to swim, shoot a basketball, you know. Well, you can learn to read a lot younger than you can shoot a basketball. But anyway, it's very easy. And you can see why so many of these American schools, you know, in the 18th century, you know, the child was, being literate was a requirement of admission. So, yeah, the evidence is overwhelming that prior to the imposition of government schooling in this country, a free market of education provided very, very high literacy levels, as you would expect in the 18th century Enlightenment. All we need is, again, I'll close with this. So we need 2 things: culture of reason, venerating the mind, and a politics of individual rights. It's all we need in this country, or any country. Doesn't matter if it's Cambodia, or Zimbabwe, or El Salvador, or the United States. Doesn't matter. We're dealing with human beings. What we need is to venerate the mind, and we need a politics of individual rights and freedom. That's all we need. I said that was less, but go ahead.
What is
ask
the
me something.
origin of the term robber baron?
What's the origin of the term robber barons? Matthew Josephson wrote a famous book on this in the 1930s called The Robber Barons. I don't think he originated the term. It comes from I'm guessing. I'm not a historian. My guess is, but it's an educated guess. My guess is that the term originated in medieval Europe, where the literal barons, the aristocracy, gained wealth by plunder, by stealing it. And then the enemies of capitalism applied that late 19th, turn of the 20th century to great productive geniuses like Carnegie, Rockefeller, James J. Hill, J.P. Morgan, Edward H. Harriman, et al. Certainly, Matthew Josephson's book, The Robber Barons, in the 1930s was very influential. And Josephson based it on Gustavus Myers. Myers was a socialist, turn of the 20th century, Great American Fortunes, something like that, which argued that these American businessmen who were millionaires, or even billionaires by that time, had gained most of their wealth by bribing congressmen, defrauding customers, exploiting labor. And I've read large parts of Myers' book, and I've done the research, and I know that in case after case after case, he repeats fables, falsehoods, distortions, half-truths. And the truth is that if you read how people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and people like that made their money, these were productive giants who immensely increased the supply of steel and oil products, etc., consequently brought the prices way down. But Matthew Josephson didn't originate the term robber barons, but his book, The Robber Barons, published in the 1930s, popularized it. It became popular in American history, I think, after Josephson's book in the 1930s, which you can get from Amazon. Not that I recommend it. It's a piece of undiluted garbage, but you could certainly read it. All right. Thanks for coming, everybody.